This is quite a rollicking ride we're about to go on. We're about to sort of blast off to a valence that's a little bit farther out than any of the practical information we've had in the last couple of sessions. But just to sort of segue from where we were, I would say that, being a San Francisco entrepreneur and the operator of a nonprofit in Europe, I would say that I always find one of the things that Europe offers is a venue to talk about the why. The cultural value and the sort of underpinnings of what it's going to do for the society of the technology, rather than in San Francisco, which tends to be more purely based on the bottom line and the graphs that go up and to the right. So here's the largest valence that we'll come in from, and I wanted to talk about this being future London. One of the things we really need to think about is what is London? What is a city? And there are a lot of different things. You can sort of approach that from some very distant view, sort of looking at what are the constituent parts of the city. And in one way that's really interesting when we talk about this culture of making, is that the city is actually an accretion of culture, right? The city is the biggest thing that we've made as humans, right? This is an object which is about millions of people working together to collaborate in a physical production process. So, it's interesting as we talk about, we're going to make objects that are connected to, that bring society, into our hands and into the ground. It's already here and we're living inside of it. It's a huge technological spacecraft that has tons of moving parts, and we're the ones who made it already, and we've been making it for hundreds of years. Another thing that's even more abstract is that not only is it a physical instantiation, but it's an ongoing process. It's a rule set that we've created as a society to talk about how we can work together. And that's about, how do we zone things? What are the instances of organization that exist inside those zoning, like corporations or nonprofits or government agencies? And how do all those things interact over time? And this is something that is not necessarily written down anywhere. It's not something that's inscribed in the architecture. It's actually sort of a noumenal field, a cloud already floating over the city, which is that of sort of civil society, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then finally, we talk a lot about platforms, I talk a lot about frameworks, and again, the city as an infrastructure, both organizational and physical, is a platform for optimized cohabitation. It is the product of our ability to bring flows of resource and production and societal interaction together into tighter and tighter loops, such that we can build bigger and bigger things. We can aim this kind of huge gun at the production of all sorts of things, like cultural production, but also physical production, sometimes unfortunately warfare. But this is like, part of the reason why cities existed in the first place is that they were spiraling upward in this ever sort of broadening kind of set of capabilities that humans could produce. And then of course, the thing that's like the most amazing part about cities is that they're not always the same thing. They are constantly, it is metabolic, it's something that's always changing. So a city, you can say that a city is London, but there's, all of the buildings of London could be replaced in the same way that all of the cells in your body could be replaced and you would still be you. London can be totally reconstituted over the course of centuries and yet still be London. And there's something about that, which is the encoding of a bunch of patterns and a bunch of kind of understandings of the individual constituents that bring it together, that makes it London. And so there's a huge kind of complex metabolism that we're always participating in every day, and we're sort of viewing it from our local circumstances, but there's no question that there are huge flows of material and capital and information that are moving through. Segueing to that slide, this is really what we're talking about when we talk about, how do we affect change in the city? We're always moving some of these sort of entities around. We're always working in the media of matter, energy, and information. Now, of course, those are, basically physics is constituted of all three of these things as well, so you can sort of break anything down to these components if you want to, but really the city is actually one of the things that you can take a step back and realize that that's really what's happening. You can say, I understand that a city is about transit networks. We've started to see those things arrive, in terms of things like, flocking cars or train time applications that improve people's ability to manage their transit situation. And those things have improvements on a local level for individuals, but they also perform huge optimizations of how the city works, right? Something like Airbnb, for instance, changes the ratio of empty units in a city, right? There are empty residences that were sitting around, and Airbnb moved in to allow those things to circulate on the market and become more highly optimized. So we have all of these different types of media that constitute the city. And so what is it now as we in the technology industry we've aimed this kind of the way that the network works is it sort of non-linearizes, it breaks apart and moves into convection all of these little pieces of various media that it looks at. So we've done that for print, obviously, was one of the first things that was a revolution. Then we did that for music, we've done it for film, and now we're moving on to sort of the built environment. And that's the thing that really has everyone kind of thinking about what the next phase is. Well, I'd say the Internet of Things and the built environment, which are really just, sort of scaling differences are the only things that separate those two things. But it's really about things that exist in the world and our relationship to them. How do we change that to become more fluid and recombinant in the same ways that we've done that to all these other mediations that we've looked at before. So, you can make some really simple metaphors, which I think are too trite really to hold up under further investigation, but there is definitely this understanding that there is, infrastructure, and then there are organizations, and then there are projects within those organizations, right? And that is pretty much the same thing that you find in, when you define a stack, as technologists like to talk about, their industry. You have hardware, an operating system, and applications. And so I would say one of the things that I find really interesting about this moment is that there's been a lot of work in hardware. Obviously, London, I think when it was interesting when people were talking about why London, one of the things that I think is so amazing about London is that there is an incredibly developed infrastructural network here. I mean, because of, sort of leading the wave of industrialization as a capital, London has accreted enormous capabilities in terms of the ability to move its residents around, to move product around, to move information around. I mean, the resilience of the networks here is almost unparalleled. There are, I'd say, the new Asian cities are probably some of the only places in the world that have quite as much capacity for that type of transformation. So that's actually something that's really worth keeping in mind when you think about what types of opportunities there are here, is that, as we talk about, the transformation of the idea of cities, London is already ready to be kind of a prototyping ground because it has so many of these capabilities already activated over somewhere, say, like San Francisco. One of the things that's interesting when we're talking about, the idea that the technology lives in the peninsula and the culture lives in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. In London, those two things are folded on top of each other. So you have the cultural industry and the technology industry in the same space, which sort of enables a lot more faster turnaround time to thinking about some of these things. But what I would say in the sort of simplistic division that I'm talking about in these three layers is that one of the things that we haven't really gotten to is this idea of the operating system. And of course the operating system is something I think a lot of people find a little bit squidgy because it actually is something that implies top-down control, right? You don't want to think, certainly you don't want to be operated on as a citizen of the city. So you don't want to be receiving instructions about where you're supposed to go. But the whole point of the way that the operating system works is that it's a platform to open up capability. So the idea, what an operating system really does is bundle up a whole bunch of drivers that refer to different types of hardware. Like on a PC, the operating system mainly manages, the disk drive and the speakers and the display and things like that, and handles all the input and output. So if a city has all of this infrastructure that then can have applications that live on it, what it needs is something to bind all of those resources together into a way that the application could take advantage of that. So I might skip through some of this because I don't think I have quite as much time as I'd like to explain kind of why this has happened in the city. But just to zoom through the idea, there's a moment where the city was born, and that was born in the idea of organizational abstraction, right? The tribe knew exactly where the healer was, and they knew where the chief lived, and there was no sense of the city outside of sight. You came out of your tent in the morning, and it was like, there is everyone. there is no need to think about this in a second-hand or third-hand way. The city, of course, much larger than you can hold in your head as an individual, looking at individuals. So you have to come up with ways of creating sort of regimes of organization and understanding around that. And so, in a way, the city already has an operating system, which is that it has abstracted resources into these ways of thinking about the city that are larger, like law, right? Law is actually programming for the state. It's programming for a city. Like, well, how do we all live together? Do I get to kill you if you come onto my property, for instance, which is fortunately not usually a question in the UK. In the US, sometimes a little bit more of a controversial issue. So, but these are the things that they're relevant in individual interactions, but they also they bubble upward into a society, right? Once you start setting those rules, it's like any type of complexity. A single decision on an individual interaction, law around an individual interaction, creates a field effect that changes the way the whole society operates. And so, you have all of this stuff going on, and people, especially in government, in the law, sort of spend their days thinking about how that type of complexity, what type of resultant complexity will emerge from those types of changes, which is very hard to predict. The other thing that's interesting is that, this is another consequence of that, of those little tiny changes that produce big results, is that, architecture itself is a rule system, and the idea that, you mainly through the concept of something like zoning, you actually sculpt the possibility space of resultant architecture, right? We're in a huge instance of that right now, right? Obviously, Canary Wharf is something that was, arisen out of, it's very different than the rest of London, although London itself is now changing to reflect a little bit more of Canary Wharf. But when it began, it was a field effect of you can now act like Americans over here in this space. And so build giant skyscrapers and fill them with back-end businesses. But that was an absolute rule space that then got sort of, the culture began to reappropriate that and began to work with it. And now you can see yet again, Canary Wharf is changing and things are showing up here that make it a little bit different. Speeding through, just basically talking about the idea that over time the city went from a sort of a monopole, like the idea obviously, in places where things like urban planning were born, like in France and early Barcelona, those things were projections of power, right? You have all the avenues that lead from the King's House, and London had that as well. Certainly in the skylines, you still have those issues, the sight lines toward St. Paul's and the government buildings. But now, we're sort of we're now in a situation where things are becoming a palimpsest. They're multinodal, that people are projecting there's 1,000 Londons, 1,000,000 Londons, because there are different constituencies that have found different sub-organizations of the city that work for them. And so, it's no longer about one voice, it's about 1,000,000 voices and how those are integrated, millions of voices. We're going to skip through some of this stuff because otherwise it's going to get way too crazy. The point is that now we're at a cusp where all of those changes that happened in the physical infrastructure of the city are happening in the software infrastructure of the city. And so what's about to take place, what is taking place now is the fact that we can move things between a semantic representation of space and the space itself. And what that means is we can both take information out of the city into a database and begin to work with that to understand what the city is doing. But we can also sort of move things out of the database, allow people to transform those things and begin to actuate the city differently. So the city now has a new type of skyline, right? We certainly have the skyline, I would say the Shard is like perhaps the biggest sort of disruption in people's self-image as Londoners in a long time, right? To add a new bump to the line you can draw that defines your city, as a little sketch, is pretty profound. But I had a chance to be one of the people that developed Flickr initially, and one of the things that was really interesting about that is that there was a second way. As soon as Flickr started to really bring in huge catalogs of imagery, there was a second way you could define London immediately, aside from just drawing that line, which was to type London into Flickr and get millions of pictures back from a whole bunch of perspectives. And that was also a way of instantaneously representing the city that was very much not about sort of the starchitects and the corporations behind them, but actually about the individuals on the street and what they saw and what that meant to them and why they would tag that London. So, the idea that the city is now welling up, its sort of representation is welling up from thousands of perspectives rather than dropping from the sky like giant crashed spacecrafts onto the shores of the Thames, is slightly a different way to think about it. So, as I was saying before, the idea that you can move this information from the streets of the city into the cloud and back again after some transformation means that the sort of the metabolic loops that I was talking about before have this incredible accelerant, which is the network. The network, like I was saying before, affects all media as this incredible recombinant sort of destroyer and recreator of worlds. Basically, it's the ultimate kind of postmodern environment, and that really has a huge effect on how these things are sort of the relationship between users and or inhabitants in this case and the city. So to a certain degree, what this all means is that the service that needs to sort of arise out of this relationship between applications like Airbnb and Flickr and the actual city itself, which is the actual physical spaces that it's being projected upon, is a set of APIs. I believe that in the coming years, I think there are a lot of people that were here on the stage earlier today that talked a lot about the kind of the constituent parts of this thing, but I think eventually a city will, along with its transportation agencies and its waste removal agencies and its water supply, will have data services, right? I mean, already, gov.uk represents this, ODI, some of these things are already emerging, but the idea is that a city will have, it's not Flickr's job to maintain, all the images of London. It's actually London's job. London, it's like that, the idea that a city can represent itself digitally as well as it can represent itself physically in the skyline is actually a huge part of the deal, right? It's a huge part of how, why we came together to form cities in the first place was the pooling of resources, right? So we pooled shelter, we pooled transport, we pooled the ability to get, huge amounts of food to one place or whatever. But the other thing we haven't yet pooled is this idea of information about place. So the idea that there are agencies that will do this pooling and allow applications to be built on top of that. Of course, one of the reasons why you might choose London is that London had the biggest database of information about itself that you could use as a developer of locative applications. So I think that race will soon be on. I think it already is on, and I think that we're kind of entering this age where people will start to realize the value of the feedback loop that they have between the software that they use and the space that they live in. And as they do that, there's this opportunity to really, for people to collaboratively begin to affect the future of the city in ways they were never able to do before, right? This idea of collaborative urban planning, what will it look like next? Use your voice to express how you think that's going to work. All of these opportunities are really there to allow people to, they're both people that are in the technical field to build the applications that people will use, and then also the end users that can consume these applications and make powerful changes to their own environment and utilize it more effectively. All of that, is sort of, coming together through a lot of different tools. And so some of the tools we've already talked about, the idea of sensor networks and how they might, allow bigger understandings, these kind of huge visualizations that I've was working on at Statement and at Bloom, this idea that you can bring a whole bunch of information together and produce kind of an understanding of the city that actually wasn't available before, because we now have so much integrated real-time data that you can actually see those kind of metaphoric metabolisms I was talking about. Those are actually realizable in dashboards and tools about the function of the city, transit systems and various different demographic understandings and things like that were really not available before. Dynamic infrastructural services is kind of the next level. That's where you start talking about Google's car services, or adaptive transit, or adaptive power usage, things where you start to actually use smart infrastructure to change the way that resources are redistributed around the city. That actually begins to, that's a whole another sort of multiplier on the types of efficiencies you can achieve. And for sustainability in the long term, we're not talking about individual users of power, but London itself as a city can begin to hugely optimize how it provides for its citizens, and also for individuals that want to reuse spaces in different ways, right? This space here can obviously have a lot more, the way the projections work, the way the speaker systems work, that can be dynamic and adaptive in a way that it's not right now. There needs to be a lot of pre-configuring, but potentially there's a way you can just have things that were easily reconfigured for their use, as they were being entered. The projector is coming down, the speakers are tuned to specific microphones and things like that, just because that's the type of efficiency you could happen in instances all across the city for different reasons. And then finally, I mentioned a little bit before, this idea of collaborative modeling. You know, the idea that there is a wiki of place, but not just about like, I want to describe this place, but actually, here is an object represented in a computational system that has verbs on it, right? There is a microphone here that has the verb to use or to, you know, turn on or turn off, and that's something that is accessible, could be accessible by any number of applications, right? And if you can actually provide a set of tools that say, here is the environment that you're in. We have at a certain level of granularity, we have recorded all of the things in the environment and their operation. And you can now build applications that take advantage of all of those things and string them together in grammars that represent tools that people can use every day. So there's a whole other piece that I'm not going to get to, but I do want to talk really briefly about this idea that, you know, I think that what we really need is a way to think about what those tools are that we're going to use in these environments. And rather than calling them applications or even apps, I've elected to call them instruments, because I think instruments has a really interesting dual phrase, one of which is about expression, the play through instruments, and the idea that you can use instruments to you know, affect your environment, affect the people around you, and also scientific instruments, the idea that you're understanding science, essentially, you're understanding information in the environment through the use of these tools. Zooming forward again. So, you know, obviously mobile devices, I'd say, are the things, and I would say specifically the things that provision mobile devices are what I would call instruments, things that allow you to understand what's happening in the transit network, things that allow you to affect the lighting in the room that you're in. You know, all of these tools are moving in and out of your local control as you need them. You can provision them from the cloud and say, at this moment, I'd like to be able to control the lighting over there, and then based on a rule system that's defined by the sort of society, you know, it depends, you know, there are definitely things to work out. It's like, who decides what's happening with the lights over there? Obviously, there's something to be worked out in that interaction. But, you know, there are so many of these things to build. You know, once we have the sort of substrate of the informational layer about the city kind of activated, there are tons and tons of instances, you know, which is, I think, really what is the enablement of the market. You know, in a city that has those tools going on, there's a whole another type of application, which is about these, you know, computational systems to help people use their environment more effectively and to understand their environment more effectively. I'm going to go to the very end here. So this is, you know, the idea that right now, I mean, one of the metaphors I'm always making is about massively multiplayer online games, because they're basically computationally the thing that's almost complex enough to be representative of a city. They're still not there, but the idea that, you know, one of the things that we'll be looking for in the future is this idea that you might actually have a social network that brings you together in space. Like, Foursquare almost does it, right? You sort of think about checking in, we're all checking into the same place. But what happens when you have different roles in space? You know, one person is the navigator, another person is the mediator, you know, another person is the person who's logging the adventure, they're taking the photographs, another person is, you know, looking on devices to find references about what you're doing. You know, all these are different dynamic roles, and you can know in real time information about other people that are moving in your environment that are part of your team, or whatever, the type of people moving in the environment with you. So I think one of the other things that these types of frameworks enable are different organizational configurations that are far different than we know. I think there's a potential for kind of a Cambrian explosion outside of, you know, what we call the company or the nonprofit or the social group or the family. You know, there are lots of different ways that people come together, and if you have sort of adaptive ways of bringing them together, you can sort of collaboratively perform the city in real time as you go as a group. I think that's it.